Hello, I am Yin, and today I wanted to talk about the 7 sins and virtues, as well as casual desire, a balance of sin, and self-neglect, which is an excess of virtue, perhaps. Taking reference from just the general Taoism idea of balance, and the sins and virtues come primarily from Dante's Inferno, but also from some general Roman Catholicism, though Dante's Inferno is the most popular. Now, I don't know whether or not the Catholic Church officially recognizes Dante's Inferno as canon, or not, but it's fairly popular and interesting. Now, the first one I wanted to go over is greed/avarice versus charity. There wasn't really a media example that stood out to me too much, but my first thought was Greed from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which does have a unique aspect in the end, which I'll go over in a minute. But typically, greed and avarice is associated with money, but it can also just be wanting to have anything, to the point of stealing it, taking it, just for the sake of having it so it is yours, the want for more. And with charity, it is giving to other people what you can spare. Now, money consciousness is important. If you give away too much, you won't have anything for yourself. So it is important to have money. Now, with the sin of greed/avarice, there is kind of two ways it can go, which is stated in Dante's Inferno, which is both overspending and underspending. With overspending, you just use that money in order to fulfill another form of greed to gain more and more of an object, or in some cases an event, I suppose. But to keep it to greed specifically, just to purchase more and more of certain objects, leaving you with no spare money to actually focus on your essentials. And then there is underspending, where you just keep gaining and gaining money without ever spending it on anything, just for the sake of having all that money. So in the end, greed is just about having more and more. But you do need to balance the two, because you do need to make money. It is important to spend money on enrichment, as it is something humans need, not just other animals, but it is important to focus on the essentials first. And with actual charity, if you are capable of giving to others, then that is good. But it might sometimes, if you do not have enough to give and still be okay yourself, then maybe focus on yourself for a while first. Now, the interesting part about Full Metal's greed is that in the traditional sense of greed, he does just want more and more of everything. But also, in the end, all he really wants is a group of people to be with and share the world with, essentially, which is interesting. Next up, we have lust and chastity. Now, in Dante's Inferno, in the lust ring, which is actually the first one encountered, the punishment there is gusts of wind knocking everyone around, which I suppose symbolizes how a person's passions and various different things just throws them from one place to another, going from passion to passion. Lust is typically portrayed as sexual, but is just about an intense passion in general. Bloodlust, wanderlust. Now, human beings do have such desires, and it can be engaged in healthily. It is sometimes a way people might use to bond with their romantic partner, or to have children, because that's how it has to happen. Adoption is possible, but the child still had to come from somewhere to begin with. Chastity, if people want to... I can't really think of chastity to any extreme other than trying to force it onto other people, but that is an issue that exists with all of these, honestly. But if, say, all human beings were to engage in complete chastity, then the population wouldn't exactly continue. And with all things, it's supposed to be done in moderation, to understand it's a thing people do, but not to do it to an excess. And something somewhat commonly done is to not necessarily villainize or demonize sexual intimacy, but kind of disgustify it, which is interesting, but in a way understandable, but to the point where it creates a hypocrisy of you're not allowed to, and yet also create children, which is a confusing paradox. And with lust, it can also lead to forced lust, and I'll leave it at that, to not further risk YouTube trying to ban this or whatever. But, for the representation, I just went with King Minos from Ultra Kill, not for any specific reason, but just because he does have domain over the Lust layer in that game, and also because he does have those wind attacks, or similar, as example from Dante's Inferno's Lust Ring. Oh yeah, something else I did put here was healthy one-night stands. Not something I understand personally, but again, humans have desires. You make it known that it's just something you are doing this one time. You don't make a person think it's going to be something more without the actual intention of doing so, is what makes it emotional manipulation or leading a person on. But again, you make it known, you preface it, one night stand, at least after the fact, because drunk sometimes, I guess. But yeah. And now with wrath and patience, which is very similar to what I explained about excessive passiveness versus excessive assertiveness in my brief Taoism video. Obviously, letting anger take control, even in less of a physical sense, clouds judgment and can lead people to say things they do not necessarily mean, but can have quite the impact on people's mental state, as well as your own. And then there's, of course, physical wrath, causing harm to people and or the environment around you, destroying your own home and possessions in anger. And with excessive patience, kind of just leads to sloth, I suppose. But with excessive patience, you are always waiting, never standing your ground, asserting, taking action, which allows you to be a pushover and to never really get anything done. Anger can also sometimes be used as motivation, such as taking your anger out in exercise without over-exercising, but not to let that anger take control over you. Now, Now, for this one, I chose Bale the Dread. Most of these weren't for any particular reason, such as this one too, but I still felt that Bale was an appropriate choice for Wrath. And now one I do have more of an example for is Sloth and Diligence. Sloth being a lack of awareness, motivation, or even trying, just sitting there and wasting away forever. With Diligence, you want to be on the lookout, you need to work and exert effort, but overworking yourself leads to exhaustion and thus death, but so does excessive sloth, or just sloth in general, because the sins are, in and of themselves, excess. It is important to relax after work, but not so much so to where no work gets done. And as I just said, work without breaks takes a large toll on both mental and physical health, so it's important to balance productivity with mental and physical health. Now for media reference, I chose the main antagonist of In Stars and Time, which is the King. His whole thing, his mechanic and motive, is that he doesn't want the world to change. He's afraid of the change, and so what he does is freezes everything in place. He freezes people in place in order to avoid that change, as change takes a lot of both physical effort as well as mental effort. Even if you are not creating that change, having change occur around you, such as a city being built around a rural area, can create a mental strain. And King, instead of dealing with anything, though in Stars and Time there is more of a deeper motivation than just change itself, but overall it is about change and wanting to keep everything as is, and so he learns to manipulate time in a sense, and tries to freeze the entire world in place. Next up, we have Gluttony and Temperance, another general one, so I just went with Beelzebub from Helltaker. Beelzebub is also the biblical demon of sloth. Now with Gluttony, it's like sort of very similar to greed, except specifically with food. Not just hoarding food, but specifically devouring it. So overeating can lead to a lot of health issues, such as heart disease and diabetes, but temperance being preserving food, restricting food intake. Temperance taken to a degree, or undereating, also leads to a lot of health issues. Both are forms of malnourishment. One is excessive nourishment, one is a great lack of nourishment. With both can come fatigue, but I think fatigue is more common with undereating, as you don't give your muscles enough to even have the energy to move. Though another interesting thing I did think of with gluttony was the Wendigo from Native American folklore. I don't know any, if at all, specific tribes it might have come from, but I do know the general of the story, which is a person engages in cannibalism, and then that desire arises in them, and they want to eat more and more people, forever being insatiable, and as they eat more and more people, they become more monstrous. So I thought that was an interesting example of gluttony in folklore. Not really sure why I put unity. Maybe with eating, your food is digested, and that energy is put throughout your body, and even the vitamins and minerals within it. So, in a sense, I suppose a form of gluttony could be devouring other people in order to make them part of you. That's not similar with the Wendigo story, I suppose, although the monstrous form part is really the only folklorish part. There is some truth to cannibalistic desire within that, but with that, the Wendigo story and Unity is much more of a fantastical version instead of more realistic, but I still found it interesting. Same thing goes with Freezing in Time with Sloth, though. Now, envy and kindness. Now, I don't know if kindness really fits the opposition of envy very well, but that's all I could really find that was said to be its opposition. But anyway, envy is being intensely jealous of other people, to want what they have, and sometimes even to just take what another has. A sort of toddler mentality. It's not necessarily that you don't have that thing, but other people do, and so you want it. That is envy. But another part could be, going more into toddler mentality, is you may have that thing, but just the fact that another person has it must mean that their version is better, and so you must take theirs. And with excessive kindness, very similar to charity or even excessive humility, is to forgo oneself for the sake of others, instead of taking from everyone for yourself, and not necessarily in a hubris sense. Whereas with hubris, you already believe you are above everyone else. With envy, you are actively jealous of what everybody else has, which sort of stems from a place of self-loathing. Envy and hubris can both lead to all of the other sins, but envy cannot lead to hubris, and I don't know if hubris can necessarily lead to envy if it's in full hubris. Now, other than just stealing from other people, another example of envy would be to kill those you are jealous of, so there is nothing left to be jealous of instead of just overcoming it. An example being Cain killing Abel out of envy, which some will say that the first sin was the eating of the fruit of knowledge, but I think Cain and Abel might actually be the story of the first sin of all people, instead of just general disobedience, but that can be considered a sin as well. Another part is in killing the person in envy, killing a person and then trying to become them, replace them. Instead of trying to find yourself, you just constantly take exactly what is of other people and try and become that, instead of adapting it. Now, I don't remember what the book was called, but there was a children's book read to me in, I think, first grade, which was a story about a girl who essentially had a stalker, who over the course of the book became more and more like her, mimicking her style of speech, the food she ate, and eventually even dressing like her, and trying to take on her entire personality. Given it was a children's book and not a fairy tale, there is no murder involved, but still thought it fit in. Now, taking envy and balancing it with kindness is taking reference from other people and choosing to be inspired as opposed to jealous. And in the back we have Godric the Golden from Elden Ring. And what he does is something called grafting, which is he basically takes the limbs of other people and fuses them onto himself. And in Elden Ring lore, he is a bit of a coward. He keeps running away from any actual conflict and keeps trying to find ways to steal the power of others. And then we have pride/hubris and humility. Obviously, with this one we have the story of Lucifer, which I don't know if I'll go into too much detail or not, as you've probably heard that one at least a little. Now, it is important to have confidence and self-worth, but if you completely forego other people and manipulate other people for self-gain, it will eventually come back to hurt you, but it will primarily hurt everyone around you. And whether or not there's charisma involved, people will become deluded to you, and if there isn't, then it can lead to sort of self-isolation, or also isolation from one's own environment or community. And with humility, similar to charity and kindness, it is important to, again, be humble, have confidence in yourself, but understand that you are not the best. But with excessive humility, you forgo oneself for others, have no sense of self-worth, and instead only choose to focus and even worship other people. So with excessive pride/hubris and excessive humility, these two will often find each other in the real world to create the most toxic relationships. A narcissist and someone who is very self-deprecating. Now, there are two forms of narcissism. I believe one is genuine narcissism, actually believing oneself to be greater, and the other is a sort of coping mechanism for self-hatred, trying to convince yourself you're better than everyone else and acting narcissistic just to mask the fact that you actually don't like yourself. And to balance the two, it's important to have concern for others, but to also have a sense of self-worth. Now, one of my favorite series is called Dungeon Meshi, which I'll probably have to put a little scene at the beginning for some spoiler warnings. But if not, I'm just gonna go ahead and preface that now. Spoilers for Dungeon Meshi. Now, the Winged Lion is an entity that has descended to, I think they still call it Earth in the show, but wherever the lands that the focus on resides, and the Winged Lion goes there from a dimension of infinity, essentially. And what the Winged Lion does is it constructs this dungeon around its dungeon master to entrap the dungeon master there. And to entice and keep the dungeon master, the Winged Lion will grant any desire and any wish. But not just for free. What the Winged Lion then does is it eats another desire in turn, sometimes even the same desire that was wished upon. So as you gain the desire you wished for, you lose the actual feeling of desire for it altogether. which I think is a very good analogy turned literal for hedonism. Hedonism is sort of the lifestyle of just going out and seeking pleasure constantly, forgoing anything else and just focusing on pleasure. But as you engage more and more in pleasure constantly, it begins to actually lose its value, its pleasure, its worth. And so the more you indulge, the more empty you actually end up feeling in the end. So, that's why I thought the winged lion was a very good example of that. I think that's all I have to say for now. Maybe I'll do a better version of this in the future. I'm not sure how it was, especially with how I'm not very good at the tone in my voice, so maybe I haven't been very captivated. But I hope at least some people found this a little interesting or insightful, and as always, I would like to hear your thoughts in the comments below, what more you might want to add, what things I could have missed or touched on a little more, said differently, etc. But anyways, thank you all for watching. Take care, and I hope to see you again. Goodbye, for now.